Today his presentation is titled, Effectively Managing Undergraduate Student Projects.
Thank you very much, Julia. And actually the award, just to clarify that I won, was for teaching excellence, not research excellence. I didn't get that award, unfortunately. I didn't apply. So thank you very much for coming. This is an interactive session as advertised in the program related to project-based learning. I attended the conference last year and presented on project-based learning. It was actually my first introduction essentially to digital humanities other than Congress that year because up to then I was appointed solely to the Department of Teacher Education and only recently became Director of Digital Humanities. But what I was pleasantly surprised to find is that my research area around project-based learning, which had been linked to teacher education solely, was actually very integral to digital humanities work. And that is certainly being reinforced by the sessions yesterday and also this morning. And so we've heard from a number of very skilled experts related to project management and project-based learning. Some of them are faculty, some of them are graduate students. Yesterday we also heard from some undergrads from Ryerson who had just graduated. And so there's been a number of really interesting sessions. What I want to do is sort of turn this session over to you because I expect virtually everybody in this room has contributed to a project in an academic setting in some way, or in many cases perhaps led or co-led projects as well, working with students and colleagues. And so today's session is really focused on what are some of the best practices that we can share amongst each other related to managing projects at the undergraduate and graduate levels in an academic setting. So I want to just briefly share with you the agenda for the next 15 minutes or so. I want to begin with an activity which some of you may be familiar with. If not, I'll certainly explain it, called Two Truths and a Lie. And then I'm going to talk about project-based learning, provide you with a brief definition, and also talk about the phases of project-based learning. And then I want to talk about project management knowledge areas. My area of research currently is really looking at applying best practices related to professional project management that you would find in the professional management certification exams and things like that, to project-based learning both at the undergraduate level and also the K-12 level as well. And I think I'm finding that those two really go together really well. So I want to share with you some foundational knowledge related to that. Then I do have a video, short video, about 3 minutes long, that I'd like to show you and ask you to do something with as you're viewing that video. It comes from Stanford University. And then I want to talk about something called, what I call the 3M cycle, which really focuses on that key stage in project management. We're actually executing projects and making sure that they go as flawlessly as possible through that process. And then we'll touch on the project-based learning proposal components. And I'll be, once again, turning things over to you, asking you what are the key things that we should be looking for in a proposal that a group of undergraduate students put together for a project they'd like to work on as part of a course. So this is really meant to be a very interactive, participatory, discussion-oriented session. And we'll close by looking at risks related to project-based learning. And I've actually handed out two things to you. One of them is an article that I've written for a website that doesn't exist, but will exist soon, called eduproject.org, something that I've started as part of this Chancellor's Chair grant. And we're currently collecting monographs, and I'm approaching different people and certainly invite anyone that's interested to speak with me. This is an example of a monograph, and when that site launches in October at eduproject.org, it's on that sheet, we'll have a number of monographs related to best practices around project-based learning, both at K-12 and also undergraduate and graduate education as well. And then the other handout I've given you is a little bit of a worksheet that we're using throughout the next 40 minutes or so, and also on one side is spelling out some of the details about the definition of project-based learning that I'm going to give you in a couple of moments. So first of all, our activity. So on that one-page handout, I'm going to ask you to work in your small groups, and for this you might want to actually move so that we kind of balance out the groups a little bit. For example, the back group, if there's willing to be maybe one or at least one person, maybe two, is willing to move to another table, and Julia might want to join another table, and maybe this table in the middle, and so we just have 3 or 4 people or 5 or whatever at each table. The activity that I'd like to do to start today, to get you talking about your experience with projects, either as a participant or as a leader of projects, is to come up with 3 statements. And 2 of those statements, these are one-line statements. Two of those statements are going to be true statements about your experience, either as a participant or leading projects, ideally with an academic setting, but you can draw on different settings if you'd like. And the other statement that you're going to write down is a lie. It's a non-truth related to your experience, or actually not related to your experience of actually leading a project. And then what I'd like you to do in your small groups is, once you've had an opportunity to everyone to write down your own 3 statements, each person, I'd like you to just read them out to each other one at a time. And I'd like the other people in the group to try and guess which of the 3 statements you've written down is not true, which is the lie of the 3 statements that you've written down. So you're going to write down 3 statements that focus on your work related to projects in an academic setting, ideally. 2 of those statements are true, 1 is false, and then after everyone's had a chance to do that, I'd like you just to take the next few minutes just to go around, read your statements out, and have the other people try and guess which one of the statements that they feel is the lie. And that buzzer will go off when a lie is told. Okay, so if you could just, if you don't mind doing that, I'll wander around if you have any questions. Feel free to introduce yourselves as you do this exercise, of course.
So just any kind of statement?
3 statements. You can try and stump people if you want. Yeah, the goal of the activity is to try and stump them. Which is the lie, which is not a lie. This is actually a gamification strategy in teaching. I'll give you another minute if that's okay. Just write out the 3 statements. And you're trying to stump the other people at your table. Which one of those is the lie, right? 2 are true, 1 is a lie.
Number one, I was surprised at my students.
Once everyone at your table is completed, feel free to start sharing one at a time, just reading out, one person reading out the 3 statements, the other people guessing which one they think is the lie. Also, feel free to introduce yourselves.
I was super stressed. I'm perfectionist, so I was surprised at my students' life. Sure.
Yes.
I think
There.
yeah.
So all 3.
No, one at a time. Read your 3 statements out. Okay. And then, yeah.
In this particular you're not a spy. Since had she's really
First one is delegated to students. I don't know if the first 2.
Folks, can I bring you back here for a moment? Can I have the class's attention? Thank you. I do want to give you one more minute in case there's some people that haven't had a chance to share, but after that I'll call the group back. If everyone has had a chance to share, what I'd like each group to do now is to pick one to share with the larger group. We won't have an opportunity to share all of them, but if there's one that you could share with the larger group, and perhaps pick the one that you think was the best in terms of stumping other people at the table, and that will hopefully provoke some discussion. So share the rest if there's something to do, and then pick the one that you'd like to share with the rest of the group.
I know, the summertime. Oh, I guess
Okay, can I call your attention again, if you don't mind? Can we perhaps hear just from each group one of the 3 statements that you think might stump us the most? This group was laughing a lot, I noticed, at the back. So I'm anxious to hear what. So which from your group is going to share with us the 3, and then we'll try and. Okay, the best liar, right? We'll call it. All right.
So my first one was, I was surprised at my students' lack of curiosity. Number 2, I was super stressed out throughout the project. Number 3, I met regularly with student groups.
Okay. Anybody want to guess which of those 3 statements is the lie? You want to read them out again to us, please?
I was surprised at my students' lack of curiosity. I was super stressed out throughout the project. I met regularly with student groups. That takes number 1. Yeah. Number 3 is number 3.
Number 3 is the next guess?
No.
I'm going to be the brave one and say number 2. And read
yes,
out
it was number 2. I was not super stressed.
Okay, good. And you know, that's a very, aside from what we're talking about today, it's a very effective strategy for this game, right? Because we might expect you to have an element of modesty and not say, we assume, well, she says she was stressed. She probably was stressed. But you've actually felt a high degree of comfort leading this, maybe because you have lots of experience doing project-based learning, or you were well planned.
I just figured if something went wrong, something went wrong.
Right?
You would learn from it.
That's right. Well, that's a good, healthy attitude to have. So, very effectively done, definitely. Can we move to this group here, if that's okay?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. So, I haven't written these as personal statements, but they reflect my personal experience. A good project requires planning for both the long and the short term. Student collaborators can apply group work principles learned in class to professional group work situations with faculty and staff. Ideally, principal investigator and project manager roles should be assigned to different people.
Okay, very specific statements. Any idea, in terms of which one of those is the lie? Julie?
I was going to say number 2.
Number 2.
Is it number 2? Read out number 2 first, please.
Student collaborators can apply group work principles learned in class to professional group work situations with faculty and staff. So in my experience, there's a disconnect somewhere, and it could be contextual or just the fact that they have so much work. I was working with graduate students primarily. So it seems that they're not quite well prepared to work at the faculty level with staff, which is my role in those kind of collaborative.
So there's a disconnect between what we learn in courses and then the project work that we might do outside of courses that are ancillary to courses.
Yes.
And so bridging that is one of the challenges that we need to be thinking about. Yes, okay, that's really important. Can we move over here to this group here?
Collaborative research usually has no leader.
Okay.
DH projects are difficult to move forward without funding. And collaborative projects are best done using a combination of online and in-person methods.
Any guesses as to which one of those three? Do you?
Number one.
Yeah.
2.
It's number one?
Yeah.
Okay, read number one for us again, please.
Collaborative research usually has no leader.
Okay, so it should have a leader, right?
I would argue that it should.
Yeah. Yes. But it has to be planned, though, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Not a word that applies.
Okay, good. Let's move over to this group, please.
Number 1, in a group environment, one person often emerges as a natural leader, so it's best not to appoint a project manager. Number 2, it is best when the project manager also participates in the project tasks. Number 3, it is always useful to produce a timeline in advance of the project, but agree that the timeline is constantly under revision.
Okay. Any suggestions on which of those is the lie? Please. Number 1? Oh, yes it is. Read number 1 for us again then.
In a group environment, one person often emerges as a natural leader, so it's best not to appoint a project manager.
Right. I think those two statements of these two different groups actually relate very nicely to each other. It's kind of interesting. Thank you very much. This group here?
We didn't agree on it. We needed a strong project manager.
Oh, yes, too. Yeah.
So not unrelated to some of this. The timelines are strictly fixed. Project output should be used to guide project development, and iteration needs to be built in.
Okay. Very specific statements there. Any ideas on which of those is a lie? Can you read them out for us one more time?
Sure. So timelines are strictly fixed. Project output should be used to guide project development, and iteration needs to be built in.
Okay. We have a suggestion. The first one's a lie? Yes. It also relates to something Julie actually, one of her other statements, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, in many projects, some people who are part of projects come into those thinking that they're fixed, determined to make them stick, and that adds a level of stress and issues for the project, right? But in an ideal world or in a project, they have to be effective, changeable. Yeah. Can we move to the middle group, please?
Okay. Collaborative projects benefit from people with different types of skills. Everyone's more likely to follow a project plan if it's in some kind of document like a bullet list, a sketch, concept map, rubric, table, something visual. Everyone likes group projects.
Could it be free?
First is your criteria, right?
That's okay. Yeah, but that is like the central issue, isn't it, in terms of collaborative learning in general and project-based learning specifically. And we've heard from a number of people already at this conference about the challenges of creating a context in which people feel invited and want to participate, especially students, in collaborative projects. So, and I think we have one last group. Is that right?
Okay. Milestones have to be adjusted to complete grant requirements. PI leads research teams a collaborative endeavor, and one project becomes many through intersecting research subjects.
Okay. Any suggestions on which ones of these three statements? Can you read them out for us one more time, please?
Sure. Milestones have to be adjusted to complete grant. This is a very specific project, right?
That's fine. Yeah, I was based on your experience.
Milestones have to be adjusted to complete grant requirements. PI leads research team as a collaborative endeavor, and one project becomes many through intersecting research subjects.
Those are really good statements. Any?
There is a lie.
There's a lie there. Go ahead.
PI's lead teams as a collaborative endeavor.
Okay.
So what was it?
Say it again, Brian?
PIs don't necessarily be
In this case.
collaborative intent.
So number one.
Yep.
Number 1, read that out first then, that's the line.
Milestones have to be adjusted to complete grant requirements.
Okay,
It's so well structured, and all of our goals and expectations are so clearly identified that we
right.
met every milestone. It's
Right.
scary.
And this is a great example of a project, I'm not sure specifically, but it was a project that clearly was sponsored by an outside organization in some way, and there was an expectation that whatever, if there had to be changes within the project, they could not affect the critical path, the timelines, the deadline for the project, the deliverables, that type of thing. So you would have to make other adjustments, including maybe, I mean, I'm not saying this project, but find other additional resources to be able to meet the timelines that were originally committed to. And that's actually very common within certainly business projects, if you're building a building, right, or something like that. That's also common in academic projects that are funded, in which you've signed a contract. So yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So there's a lot of rich statements there. Some of them are lies, but many of them are truths. And some of the lies, if you just change them to the opposite, are themselves true. So they really point to some of the important things to be thinking about in terms of project-based work. I want to provide you with just a definition of project-based learning. It's my definition, but it incorporates elements that you would find in the literature related to project-based learning. And I am going to share a few of those resources with you at the end of today's presentation and workshop. The definition is project-based learning empowers learners to collaborate in teams mentored by their teachers as they research real-world questions, pose solutions to real-world problems, and design real-world products in a rigorous way. And so I've highlighted some of the key words there that I think are really important. I think this is one of the reasons why we all turn to projects as part of DH, is because of the empowering aspect of it in terms of the collaborative experience that students have, and being able to have an element of control of their own learning and see the outcomes of it as having a real impact. The notion of collaboration is clearly part of projects. Not every project is collaborative. Of course, a project can be done on an individual basis, but many are collaborative. The role of the instructor or teacher as a mentor to students, that would be a great workshop for this conference on how you actually navigate those roles as being both the supervisor of students, but also the mentor of students, and providing just-in-time help with their project. And also the notion of real-world questions, so actual academic questions that are meaningful to students, and often that have a result in a public presentation or a public dissemination of knowledge. And then this notion at the end here of rigorous, which is a really key aspect of project-based learning, both at the K-12 and the university level. And so really thinking about issues of assessment and rigor and the quality management of projects. When we look at project-based learning, typically in the literature we see these phases. We don't call them stages. We call them phases because one can morph into another, and you might even find yourself going back into an earlier phase. So it's not really a stage-based approach. But the whole notion of preparing students for project-based learning. So this is not even the project itself that you might be embarking on, but actually setting the context for it. Everything from setting up your classroom, if you have that opportunity to do so, to building the skill set related to collaborative work and group work, the technical skills that students will need to complete the project, and many other aspects as well in advance of actually starting a project. The next idea of initiating a project, so actually generating a project idea, which is its own unique stage, separate from the planning stage. And this is where you come up with a general idea for a topic, which might be the instructor or the instructor and students working collaboratively together. But before you actually move into a larger proposal phase where you're actually teasing out what that project's going to look like in terms of planning it, you are actually asking yourself, is this a feasible idea that we have for this project? So, and if you've discovered that it isn't, then you haven't gone through a whole series of planning steps which have taken time. So it's important to have an initiation process. And that can actually be concluded with a pitch. So maybe a group of students who would like to pitch a project to a professor as a directed project course, a directed study course, that's what it starts with. A meeting, 1 or 2 pager, and from that the professor can say, yeah, this is a reasonable project. I can see you doing this within the time that we have. I can commit to my time to this. I think you have the skills or can develop the skills that are needed to, and then that's the initiation step, and they can move down to the actual planning and coming up with the timelines and schedule and things like that for the project. And the planning is the next step, and actually creating a proposal or the plan for the project. I'm going to talk about that a little bit towards the end, so I won't say a lot about that right now. Then we have this really important phase, of course, of executing the project, actually carrying out, and I do want to focus on that as well a little bit later in the workshop. And then really connected, even though it's a separate phase, it's actually totally interconnected with executing, is this assessing phase, which is this 3M cycle that I referred to earlier. Managing, monitoring, and modifying, and I'll be talking about that in a few minutes as well. And then this final phase of the publishing phase, this really important, this notion of publicly sharing a project's results. This is one of the aspects that separates project-based learning from the kind of project work that many of us may have done in schools when we were younger, where you actually present a seminar to your peers. That's not really a public presentation. The stakes are not as high. It doesn't have that real-world connection. But actually, in project-based learning, there's efforts to actually connect to the real world by having outside experts who are consulting on a project, having outside sponsors that you're actually creating a deliverable for, and actually publishing, in the widest sense of that word, the results of your project, which might be entering a robot into a competition, or publishing a peer-reviewed paper, or a presentation at a conference like this, delivering a paper. So they can take on any different forms. Take a look here at the knowledge areas in professional project management. And you'll see that in the circle in the middle, these are the actual terms that are used for the process groups or the phases of projects by professional project managers, and they're very similar to what we just talked about. Initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, which is the equivalent to assessing. We use the term assessment more in education rather than monitoring and controlling. And then they have this closing phase, but I've substituted that for the publishing phase because in project-based learning, the literature, that's a really important part of it. But the closing is a really important phase as well. And in many cases, for digital humanities project, part of the closing phase is archiving all the work that's being done, and also learning best practices from that project in terms of how it was done so they can be applied to new projects. That's all could be part of a closing phase. And then around the periphery of this image, we have the actual knowledge areas of project management theory. And you can see they're there: integration management, time management, cost management, risk management, procurement management, communications management, human resource management, quality management. And so these phases all have different roles. The quality management relates directly to that assessment phase that I was mentioning earlier. The human resource management is one of the things you're going to be focusing on very early in building up the people that are going to participate in the project. You may be wanting to do a project in a course and find out that you don't have enough students, or you don't have sufficient expertise or breadth of expertise in a certain area, and so you need to do a little bit more recruitment of students, or maybe adjust the project plan, but that's related to the human resource management as well as the personnel management as well. Communications management is ongoing throughout a project. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's a massive area, of course, and making sure that everybody who's part of the project team is informed of the project's progress and has opportunities to contribute to the ongoing planning and replanning of projects. The procurement of any resources that you need. This course is a huge phase in academic research projects that are funded by outside sources. For our actual project actually begins an implementation phase. There might be a whole procurement where you're securing SHRC support, for example. Risk management I'm going to talk about a little bit later, and that's also the topic of the paper that was handed out. Cost management for expenses that are related to your project, but not just the monetary expenses, but also the workload associated with that for faculty if you're involving them, or graduate students, RA-ships, all those types of notions. Time management, massive in terms of schedules and timelines. Integration management, which is focusing on bringing all these together. So that's the real role of the project manager, and making sure all these are seamless and getting a sufficient focus. And then finally, scope management, which is making sure that a project is adhered to in terms of the project plan, in terms of what was actually originally planned for that project, and that you don't have scope creep where you're actually expanding the parameters of the project, and so now it becomes that it's not possible to complete it. So that's a very short summary of these process areas in professional project management theory. So I'd just like you to think about these process areas, but also just the kinds of things that you've been talking about in the first exercise that we did. And I'm going to ask you to actually look at a video, about 3 minutes long, which comes from a student from Stanford University, who's part of a project team related to engineering. And what I'd like to do is show you this video, and I'd like you just, as you're watching it, to write down some of the keywords in terms of what you see as best practices related to project management that this student cited that he and his team used in their project. So as you listen to this video, normally when I do this, we don't have time, I would show you the video and then show it again and ask you to do this exercise. I'm going to have to put them together because we don't, believe it or not, only have about 10 minutes left. But I would ask you to watch this video and just write down some keywords that relate to some of the best practices that you see this student as citing that he and his project team used in their project.
My name is Derek O'Ying, and I am an undergraduate at Stanford University. In 2011, I was an apprentice in Island Team, one of the 6 global student teams in the AEC Global Teamwork project-based course offered at Stanford with partners worldwide. Our challenge was to design a 30,000 square foot university building in the University of Puerto Rico while being remotely located around the globe, and our team won the Swinnerton Native Challenge for our design. I think the first key to our success as Island Team was that we were excellent at communication. If language and culture are barriers, then you need to find something that transcends these barriers, and for us, it was humor. In one of our very first brainstorming sessions, Frank, our lifecycle financial manager from Germany, said that he wanted a bar in the building. And I think the first thing I asked was, how many square feet would that be? We ended up putting a cafe in the final design, and a lot of thought went into how that would activate the social space, improve circulation, maybe even turn up a small profit. In other words, we took ownership of our work and we made it fun. For the final presentation, Frank even brought us his favorite beers from Germany, and Rebecca, our architect, brought her family's native coffee from Puerto Rico. We weren't afraid of using technology to improve our communication even more. We used an online 3D immersive collaboration environment for our weekly meetings and dramatically increased our productivity because we could engage with each other as if we were meeting in person. Later, we imported our models into the same virtual space, and instead of just looking at drawings, we could experience our building from the inside out. We even brought our owners into the space on a regular basis and allowed them to engage in the design process. In this online virtual environment, we learned to develop work practices and communication protocols that were unique and worked for us. When we ran our weekly meetings, we didn't waste time doing show and tell. We immediately identified problems and split into subgroups to solve them. At the end of the hour, we drew up an action list and scheduled additional subgroup meetings throughout the week. We kept all our work transparent through file sharing, and when there were questions, we never waited for the next meeting. We emailed each other immediately, no matter what time zone we were in. When it came to design, we spent an entire 2 months developing our design with professional mentors and searching for a big idea to win the Native Challenge. We had designed a functional space for education with an interesting architectural form we called the puzzle. But it didn't feel connected to Puerto Rico. It didn't address its context. Then we found out about the student riots at the university and how Rebecca had just nearly missed a major student police standoff at the architecture school. After hearing her concerns, I suggested that we should approach our design from a new angle to address the need for greater transparency between students, faculty, and administration. We called our new design the social puzzle, and we redesigned the program layout and circulation spaces to foster the very specific types of interactions between user groups that weren't possible before. We responded to the Native Challenge with our own unique definition and took ownership of our design. I hope you enjoy your experience in the AEC Global Teamwork Challenge, and I wish you all the best.
So I wonder, is there somebody that might suggest a phrase or a word that was mentioned by this gentleman in terms of best practice related?
He used the phrase taking ownership twice.
Yes, and early on too, right? Yes. And so how do you interpret that, the importance of that to projects?
The idea that students aren't doing this as students in the usual hierarchy, that they're actually the people who are designing the project responsibly on their own.
So they feel invested in the work and it's meaningful to them.
Yeah.
Another word or phrase that you heard, Jason?
Communication.
Yes, that's really key. And so what would be an example from the video that where communication was effective?
Well, at the very start, he said something like that, we had to find a way to communicate effectively, and we managed to do that through humor.
That's right, yes.
So, and then he also went on to talk about the sort of virtual kind of representation of meeting was very effective
That's right.
achieving their goals.
In fact, it sounds like they almost had a sub-project related to the larger project of creating a virtual space where they could actually meet, which would not have been an easy task in itself, but they thought that was important enough. Because this was an international project that involved teams or sub-teams from different places, so they couldn't meet in the real world, right? So they had to find some other way. So they took the time to build up that strong communication links, and then it worked for them. Anything else that you heard or saw in the video? Please.
No fear.
Yes. In what context? How do you see that as being really important to a project? This
Well,
ties to what you were saying.
That they, when they came up against challenges or problems, they pushed through rather than backed off or panicked or
Right.
dropped out or whatever.
Right. So if they had processes in place, no doubt, and when problems came up, they talked about it in their meetings. They were able to immediately move to the problems, not all the other things that didn't need to be focused on, and so much of the meeting time to be focused on solving those problems. So they took them on directly, and as you said, they weren't afraid to take them on and let the problems beat them in a sense, yes. Any other, please?
Also the transparency
Mm-hmm.
that came up, both they applied it to the work that they were doing for the design, but also to the finished project, because they adopted the idea of transparency for students who were going to use the space.
Yes.
And I thought that was important because people working with a lot of people need to know what everyone is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of not sitting on your information and keeping it to yourself and sharing everything.
Right. So transparency actually is a really important component of the communication process in project management. The notion that even if somebody in a project doesn't need to know something, it doesn't relate to their specific work, that if it can be logged somewhere where they have a login and can see what's going on in other aspects of the project, once again, it helps them feel more ownership of the project, have a sense of how it's going in other respects beyond their own. So that's a really important aspect. And also the transparency, just as a side, can be really important in terms of work with your project sponsors as well, in terms of that's another layer of communication as well, in terms of your reports to them and how they're able to see the project iterating in terms of its development. Any other phrases or please?
Sort of kind of aligned with transparency, but sort of openness to, just thinking of the example of the student protests, so it shows sort of an openness to external forces and also just being sensitive to each other within the group. But
yes.
And I think that also is reflective of a certain creativity.
Yes.
In approaching problems, because generally openness to a variety of things.
And in connection with what you were just saying about the, I wrote down two things that were not said, but really what they were doing in terms of altering the project to more closely align to the context in Puerto Rico. I wrote down needs assessment. They usually do a needs assessment before a project, but during this project they realized that there's something that wasn't perhaps quite aligned, and they made an adjustment to their project. So I also wrote down project modification, which is a professional project management term, but the needs assessment aspect. So that also links in terms of making what they were doing respectful of the context in which they were working as well. Sir, you had your...
Just that they mentioned an action list, and it's a very simple thing, but
yes.
framing things about things that need to be done, and something that people again can take ownership of and do, rather than just list issues or problems or things that need to be addressed. It's how you're going to address them.
And I would connect to something that Brian said when he was reading out his three statements. One of the truths was the whole notion of using different types of instruments to actually track projects or to have to-do lists and sorts. You can use checklists, Gantt charts, you can use timelines, you can use schedules. There's different types of visualization approaches that can be really helpful for that. Any last one, please?
Just connecting with what Jason said about communication and transparency, and you had mentioned it earlier, it's just in time communication and
Yes.
immediacy of it.
Yes. Yes, in terms of projects, being able to alter a project if necessary at a moment's notice. It doesn't mean, but it still goes through a planning process and a meeting and a collaboration process, but having that adeptness. There's actually a whole approach to project management called agile project management, which is really focused on that notion of having that fluidity and flexibility. So it's not a fixed approach, but being able to iterate and change projects and go with the context. Sometimes as project members leave and new ones come in, those kinds of notions.
And I think especially for mobile locations, that they're getting information now.
Yes, that's really key, very much. Last comment, please.
I just thought it was interesting that a lot of the kind of ethos of their process also ended up in their product.
Yes.
The ideas of communication, of being right for the specific people,
yes.
of allowing the people, especially the students involved, sort of to take ownership of the project and the final product as well. It was kind of cool to see that happen.
Right, because you're always balancing with a project the process elements, how you get there, but really important, of course, is the product as well. And so that's really key as well. So you always got to be thinking about that final deliverable as well. I just want to share with you the 3M cycle. I'm going to close very quickly. I mentioned it earlier, managing, monitoring, modifying. But within the monitoring process, which is part of that executing process in order to keeping a project on track, the importance of these 3 sub-processes, if you will: tracking how a project is going, reporting on how a project is going, and assessing. And so the tracking is something that everybody who's part of a project will be doing for their own particular project work. Everyone who's part of a project will be reporting that to the project manager, who puts it all together in terms of overall sense of how the project's going, probably also reporting that to the project sponsor. And then if there are issues in terms of the project needs to be rescoped, it needs to be retimed or whatever, then that's through an assessment process, which can lead into the modification. So it's a bit more complex than I'm just describing here, but it's a very integral process of project management during the executing phase. And just one last comment on this: you're always going back to the project plan or the project proposal. Once it's approved, it becomes the project plan, to see how the work that you're doing in the project ties into what you've planned. And if there's a need to, as was being mentioned, you can make adjustments, but that should be done in an informed way and in a consultative way through members of the project team. Please.
As much as we learned something from this, should we also acknowledge that this kind of like the presentation that he gave reflects the kind of privilege that Diane was talking about? I was just thinking about that 24-hour clock. That's youth culture. So once you start to get a mixture of people, that becomes much less workable. And then obviously they had access to amazing technologies and probably a general level of privilege. So I wonder if we have to also figure that into the management of our projects, or we might not have all of those things.
We do, and I'm going to tie that into the last slide, if you don't, because I'm conscious that we're at the end. The components that you would put into a project proposal, and one of those is the resource requirements. Obviously you have to honor the context that you're working in, and so you may have limited resources, so certain things cannot be done. But in terms of actually putting a project together, in terms of the proposal or the plan, it may not include all of these elements, but these are some of the elements that you would definitely want to be including in that, and expecting undergraduate students to include when they pitch a project to others.
And one really helpful project management tool I find that helps with that is this triangle of goal, resources, and time, right? Because those three have to balance in order. So if you have less time, then the goal changes. You're going to get less money, then the goal changes, right? So that's a really kind of helpful, simple kind of
thing. And professional project managers call that the triple constraint. So if a project expands in terms of its scope for whatever reason, then you're going to probably need to assign more resources or more time to that in order to complete it. So those you could look up that concept if you will. I think we'll end on that note because I'm aware that there's a lunch coming up.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
just want to make an announcement before we break. So again, the lunch today is going to be in the same location as yesterday, so I see 2:30 on the second floor. And the other thing I wanted to say is that if there's any speakers from yesterday here, if you could just stay behind for about 3 minutes, and Diane, you as well, I just have to get you to sign something for me, and it'll take about 2 minutes, but lunch will be starting at noon in IC 2:30. Okay, and I'll be right with you.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed the paper that was handed out as well, and I'll talk to you throughout the day. Take care. Thank you.